So I want to just talk a little bit about some of the resistance. It goes way back, 1897, the Ku'e petitions. But I'm going to jump ahead to next slide. One of the seminal struggles was the Kaho'olawe movement. This picture is the first step onto Kaho'olawe as part of that landing in 1976. That's Walter Riddy pulling the boat ashore. The photo was by Ian Lin, who was on that ship. They stopped the bombing. They took 10 years, they spent $400 million, and only a tenth of the island is clean. So just keep that in mind. The island is about 28,000 acres. Sorry. Okay, that's good. And then Makua Valley, so within a couple of weeks of the first demonstration at Kaho'olawe, there was a rally at Makua Beach. Kawaipuna Prejin was one of the organizers who moved between different communities. So he brought it to Makua and said, hey, we got to do something for Kaho'olawe. So they had several hundred people on the beach, and they went into the valley, and somehow the guard shack made out of wood became a bonfire. But that was the beginning of this kind of weaving together of these different struggles. But there's many endangered species, most of it up in the ridges of the valley. Residents were evicted, and some of the stories were really heartbreaking. Uncle Walter Kamana, when he was still alive, testified at the hearing, that the military came in and told us you had to move out, and then they painted a white cross on our church and bombed it for target practice. So that church is still, or the remnants of it are still there. The cemetery is still there. You can go there and see it at Makua, but it's not a structure anymore. And the community that was living there is gone. And this is a place that was promised 6 months after the war is going to come back. So there have been several waves of effort to try to get it back. This is kind of what happens when bombs, and this is a fire from 2007. There was about 2,400 acres that burned. And this went across the street, and it killed some endangered species. So just a quick timeline. There are many evictions, and protests. But in 1998, Malama Mapua sued the army to force them to conduct an environmental impact statement. And through that, they were sort of able to tie up the army's hands, because the army failed to produce the environmental impact statement on time. And so the court issued an injunction that has prevented them from training, at least for the last, I think it's 8 years now. Pacific Missile Range, Kauai is getting hit really hard with the military buildup because of all the money that's flowing to the defense contractors who are doing space-based weapons, network-centric warfare, missile launches, and so forth. So they've, after September 11, they've instituted much stricter security measures on the beaches. So some of the best surfing beaches right there, you have to get a pass to get in. And the Striker Brigade was an expansion of the Army in Hawaii that came up around 2002, and many of us were involved in protesting and testifying against it. We held it up in court for several years, but ultimately the decision was already made that Hawaii was going to have its Striker Brigade. And part of that was, it wasn't all about military necessity. It was also about the who's going to get paid on this end by having all the construction projects that this expansion would bring. So there's always that push and pull that happens with the military projects in Hawaii. It's not just purely military design. And I'll give you another example, is the Pacific Command headquarters. The new facility was built a few years ago. Senator Inouye appropriated money for it. The Pentagon didn't ask for that money. It wasn't in their budget request. The senator told them that you're going to want this and put the money in there so that they could have construction projects. So around 2005, there was a student group called Kipuka was formed at UH, and they filed a lawsuit against the Army. This is a march we did from the palace to the federal courthouse. These were a scene from one of the hearings where they held the public environmental impact statement hearings on private property in order to prevent signs and other disruptions, right? So several of us got arrested trying to bring our signs in because they're telling us you can't do that. So this was the second night of these arrests happening up at Halemano. Around that same time, there was this proposal emerged that the University of Hawaii would form a classified research lab in partnership with the Navy. This would be a way to get uncompeted contracts from the Navy for weapons or radar. I think what they envisioned was missile defense related testing on Kauai that would be flowed through the University of Hawaii through this, what they call the UARC, University Affiliated Research Center. One of the issues was for a public university, which is supposed to produce public knowledge, right, increase our knowledge in general, how come the Navy gets to have this proprietary knowledge that is off limits? And what are the ethical implications of doing research that could be resulting in wars and killing and other things? So we occupied the office of President McLean for a week, and we had many other protests. The chancellor got fired. The new chancellor rejected the UARC, which was a great thing, and then they instituted it at the system level. So they had to get their UARC no matter what. Even though we defeated it at Manoa, it went to the next level and they just instituted it because it was, again, it's part of this, push to get money to Hawaii at all costs. But it was a great struggle because it brought together a really diverse coalition of students and community folks. And I think in some ways it helped some of us to think about how to work and create kipuka, little islands of resistance that by our coming together and thinking different and practicing in different ways, we demonstrate and prefigure the kind of world we want to create. So the recent threat that Terry and Rennie and other folks have been fighting is the proposal to bring Osprey and other new aircraft to Hawaii. The proposal is to station it at Kaneohe Marine Base, but it would span the entire island chain from Kauai to Molokai, Maui, parts of Hawai'i Island, would be used as training areas or as emergency landing zones and so forth. So on Molokai, folks rose up and they built an ahu right in Ho'olehua to say, no, we don't want it here. And people, they were protesting about the proposal to bring it into Kalaupapa, right? It's such a sacred space, it's such an important historical site. So the Marines backed off of that particular proposal, and they also backed off of doing training in North Kohala, up at Upolu area. But the other sites are still on the table, and they're continuing to move forward with their decision. In Okinawa, the Osprey have just arrived, and people were protesting furiously. 100,000 people came out to oppose the Osprey, and they've been blocking the gate and trying to stop it from coming in, flying kites, all kinds of creative stuff. But I heard that it just arrived this week in Okinawa. So they're really upset, and they're very interested in having conversations with us and with folks in Colorado and New Mexico who are also fighting against the Osprey there. So this is just a kind of a graphic to show all the red dots are countries with bases. The dark ones are countries with access agreements, and the yellowish green ones are with some sort of military cooperation. So it's estimated the US has over 1,000 foreign military bases around the world. And so the resistance has also been globalized too. So in Vieques, Puerto Rico, the picture on the top right is from the 70s, I think. The fishermen were blocking the Navy ships and shooting them with slingshots, and the Navy was trying to fire water cannons at them. They would go over the shallow reef with their boats, and the Navy ships would hit the reef and damage their propellers and rudders and all that. So they're really creative and really fierce in their resistance. But at that time, in the 70s, Kaho'olawe was also going on here. So PKO members went to Culebra and Vieques, and we had exchanges. So the solidarity was already starting to happen in the 70s. In 1999, a bomb killed a civilian worker, David Sanes, and it sparked a new wave of protests. Terry Keko'olani and I were on a delegation soon after those protests started, and we went into the bombing range and met with many of the protest camp leaders, and then helped to organize other folks from Hawaii to go there, from Kaho'olawe and other movements, so that we could, solidify our relationship with them. And it was a really inspiring movement. But here you see them tearing the Navy fence apart, and they would always, every time there was a training, people would get in by horseback, by sea, by cover of night, many ways to get into the bombing range as human shields, and disrupted the training so effectively that it became a liability for the Navy, and they eventually said, forget it. The other thing that's really critical is they built a powerful network, a solidarity network among Puerto Ricans in the main cities where they're located, but also in the Latino diaspora and communities in the U.S. So Chicano Mexicanos and other Latin American communities came in support of Vieques. So that was a powerful bloc that helped to push the politics forward. In Okinawa, the picture on the right top is from that recent protest of 100,000. The one on the bottom is over in another part of Okinawa called Henoko, where they're proposing to build a runway over a reef, a pristine reef area. It's a dugong habitat and fishing grounds. And so when these rigs were set up to do drilling, people occupied the rigs and blocked them for many months. And they've been very successful at tying up the whole US-Japan Mutual Defense Treaty, which is really amazing. This little island has been messing with the whole geopolitical arrangement in East Asia. And so it shows the power that they have when they're together. In the Philippines, although the bases again were pushed out, US troops are again in Mindanao, and now they've recently signed agreements to open up access for Subic and Clark and other ports for occasional military cooperation and visits. This is the VFA, is the Visiting Forces Agreement. That's the treaty that allows US troops to come into the Philippines. And it has very unfair clauses that protect US troops, if they commit crimes in those countries, from the full application of the law of those countries. So this is a feature of many of these base agreements. And then Ecuador, this was some scenes from protests there where they successfully got the US base out of Manta, Ecuador. It was used for CIA and counterinsurgency work in Colombia and to ostensibly stop drug running. But the new president and the popular movement said, no, we had enough. And so some of us went from Hawaii as part of an international conference against foreign military bases. And so soon after our gathering, the president declared that he was going to stop renew the treaty for the base. And so the US is out of Manta base. In Vicenza, Italy, US is expanding an air base into this area near a town. And so they've had a pretty intense struggle. Here they took down part of the fence and they're carrying it through the streets. And in Korea, the protests are being beat is in the Pyeongtaek village that I talked about earlier. Over on the bottom where the bombs are, that's a bombing range called Maehyeongri. And they were successful in getting the US out of that bombing range. But many people have suffered from accidents, getting shot or blown up by ordnance. In some cases, people committed suicide because the noise was just driving them crazy. So that area needs to be cleaned up. We visited there when we went. These portraits are two girls that were crushed by armored personnel carriers, US military vehicles in Korea, and so they become a symbol of the violence and the danger of the US troops in Korea. And then the upper left is just one of the many pictures of the Jeju struggle against a Navy base that is destroying a very beautiful and vital reef ecosystem and really incredible cultural sites. So they were taken to the sea, they were climbing on cranes, all kinds of stuff, just relentless, fierce, nonviolent resistance. It's really an amazing struggle, and we need to support them very much. The other thing I wanted to say is that it's a Korean base, but it's being used by the US as part of its missile defense encirclement of China. So that's something that we have to keep in mind. And in Guam, the relocation of troops from Okinawa would result in this, as I mentioned, this tremendous expansion of military in Guam. And so there's been a growing movement to stop that. Now the new proposal is, instead of 9,000 troops, is to bring 4,700 and then spread the troops around. So 2,700 to Hawaii, 2,700 in Hawaii, 2,500 to Australia, new base agreements in Singapore and Thailand and many other places. And in Australia and in Aotearoa, some activists went over. This is a NSA a spy facility in New Zealand. So they used a sickle and punctured the balloon. And then in the Marshall Islands, there have been efforts to build solidarity with them. The survivors of the nuclear tests are still suffering from the cancers. And then the residents of Kwajalein who were displaced are still living in slum conditions. And so there's been efforts to try to build support for them. And there was a group called ERUB of survivors that were both in Marshall Islands and in Hawaii, trying to organize around those issues. The Bush administration refused to hear or renew compensation for the health effects of the testing. Just in closing, I just want to refer to this quote from Atwood Makanani. He's a Hawaiian activist, a cultural practitioner, a voyager. He's been involved in the Kaho'olawe movement for a long time. And one day when we were driving out to Makua, he just kind of said, "Hey, we got to go to this meeting, right?" And so I picked him up and we're driving out there. He said, "You got a haku." Like, I don't know what do you mean by that, right? So haku is to braid or compose something, like a song or a chant, or is to braid a rope together. And so, now I think I understand that he means that we need to we need to compose our story, our history. We need to bring the strands of our struggles together in a way that makes it stronger than its individual parts. And so that even how oceanic peoples can make these fibers that bind canoes together, they can sail across seas, they can erect structures that move logs through the mountain, to the forest, then let us weave our web of solidarity so that it's strong enough to catch the big fish that threaten to eat us all. E iho ana o luna, e pi'i ana o lalo, e hui ana na moku, e ku ana kapaya. All that's above will be brought down, all that's below will be lifted up, the islands will be united, and the walls, the foundation will stand strong. So thank you very much.